very warm welcome to you all for tonight's discussion on funding defined benefit pension schemes and integrated approach. So, very brief introduction to tonight's topic. How best to apply the principles of integrated risk management is something that many of us working in the pensions field and our clients will have been thinking about in some detail over the last year or two, if not longer. But actually putting together a sensible framework for managing both funding, investment and covenant risk is something that in practice not all trustees and corporate sponsors have been able to do effectively. So this paper suggests an interesting framework for thinking about that interaction. So slightly unusual order this evening. Charles and his co-authors are going to present the paper and we'll then have comments from the opener before we open to questions from the floor. If anybody has prepared questions and intends to speak, could you put your hand up now just so we've got an idea of who has some thoughts that they'd like to share at this stage? Thank you, that's helpful. Right, all that remains in that case is for me to introduce Charles. Charles has 30 years' experience in pensions, firstly at Mercer and now at JLT. He's served 3 terms on the IFOA Council and has also chaired the Pensions Board. He currently chairs the International Board and represents the IFOA on pensions at the Actuarial Association of Europe, as well as the International Actuarial Association. In 2013-14, Charles was Master of the Worshipful Company of Actuaries, and in 2015 was Pensions Personality of the Year, thanks to some crazy marathon running, I understand. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Marion, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to present our paper here this evening, and I look forward to a really interesting discussion on the challenges of funding DB pension schemes. One of the challenges with any approach to pension scheme funding is that it is simultaneously trying to achieve 2 completely different aims. On the one hand, financing a long-term cash flow obligation, and on the other, providing security for a hugely important part of people's personal savings. This is illustrated by looking at the 5,800 remaining DB pension schemes. Either they will pay their benefits in full, or they won't, and will likely end up in the PPF. The impact of this default risk is illustrated by some research carried out by the PLSA, where the impact on members, even in strong covenant schemes, can be very significant. Now, funding would be very easy if we could ignore the possibility of default. Indeed, if there was no default risk, you might reasonably conclude that a pay-as-you-go approach was the simplest and most efficient approach to funding. Then there's the important and welcome challenge from the pensions regulator that pension funding has to be looked at in the context of a holistic, integrated risk management framework. Now, I should stress at this point that our paper looks at funding within the current regulatory environment in the UK and does not attempt to comment on the optimal framework we might suggest were we able to start with a blank sheet of paper. So I will now hand over to my co-authors. Hannah will talk about some of the relevant background research that we carried out to set the context for this paper. Jig will then look at some of the investment perspectives, which we believe are important, and then Murray will outline the funding framework that we're proposing. So, Hannah.
Thanks, Charles. The first half of our paper is all about setting the scene and providing some important context for our proposed funding methodology, which Murray will come on to later in the presentation. Many of you here tonight will be very familiar with a lot of this background, so we just wanted to touch on a few key findings from our research. The Pensions Act 1995 itself arose in the main in response to public concerns following the Maxwell scandal of the early 1990s, and the subsequent Good Committee's report, which recommended a minimum solvency requirement to secure the pension rights of members. Up until 1997, there had been minimal UK legislation requirements about the level of assets an ongoing scheme needed to hold. As a reminder, for those young enough not to remember, the funding objective of the MFR was for a scheme to hold enough assets to meet its liabilities. Firstly, to provide all active and deferred members with a cash equivalent transfer value, and secondly, to secure annuities for all pensioners. So the MFR was the first real UK regulatory attempt to answer the dual challenge that Charles referred to earlier of how to finance the long-term cash flow obligation and provide acceptable security for members' benefits. An important feature of the MFR was that where a deficit was identified, it required full funding to be reached over a prescribed and relatively short time horizon. For the majority of schemes below 90% funded, there is a requirement to reach 90% funding within 1 year, with all schemes targeted to reach full funding within a 5-year recovery period. A very different environment to the one we see today, where 1 or even 5-year recovery plans are not the norm. One of the questions we were keen to ask in the paper was whether the current more flexible scheme-specific funding regime results in better or worse outcomes than a formulaic approach like the MFR. Without a crystal ball, it's quite difficult to consider how the MFR would have evolved over time, but our simple analysis of the core principles behind MFR suggested to us that MFR would likely have produced a higher funding target now for the majority, although we accept not all, of schemes than under the current scheme-specific funding regime. We also believe that the continuation of MFR would likely have resulted in many pension schemes moving towards a matched investment position more quickly than has happened in reality. Does this therefore suggest that the old formulaic approach of MFR was actually better than the scheme-specific funding model that we have today? And are we as actuaries really adding value and creating better outcomes for our clients? Let's take a look at some of the evidence. Given the scheme-specific funding regime and the pension regulator's emphasis on employer covenant and integrated risk management, particularly over recent years, it might be reasonable to expect that we should be able to see a strong link between covenant, investment and funding across UK pension schemes. The data that follows has been drawn from the latest available statistics published by the pensions regulator. We appreciate that TPR's analysis is based on group data that is not without its limitations, and so we are simply presenting the published evidence from across the UK pensions landscape. We do acknowledge that many scheme actuaries and pension schemes will be adopting a scheme-specific approach, which does take into account, amongst other things, both the employer covenant and the scheme's investment strategy. Looking first at discount rates and covenant in this slide, we might expect pension schemes with a stronger employer covenant, i.e. those in category CG1, as defined by the pensions regulator, to adopt a higher discount rate than those schemes with a weaker employer covenant. Evidence from tranche 7 valuations, as indicated by the first column in the table, does tend to agree with this, as those schemes with a stronger covenant did tend on average to use a higher discount rate. However, the difference between the average discount rate used is only just under 0.2% per annum. Earlier, Charles referenced research carried out by the PLSA, which showed that the default risks vary significantly between strong and weak covenants. And so we might naturally expect a wide range of discount rates rather than the 0.2% shown. For valuations occurring 3 years later, i.e. those in tranche 10 in the last column, the gap actually narrows to less than 0.1% per annum. This suggests that perhaps the strength of the employer covenant is not really influencing the choice of discount rate as much as we might expect for a scheme-specific funding approach. Some may argue that the use of the pension regulator's valuation tranches is not a fair analysis, and so on this next slide we have tracked a cohort of pension schemes through 4 triennial valuation cycles, starting with the tranche 1 valuations through to the tranche 10 valuations 9 years later. As we've touched on in this paper, TPR's approach has naturally evolved over the last 10 years as it has reacted to changes in market conditions and changes in the behaviour of both trustees and employers. And so naturally we may have expected trustees' assumptions, and in particular the discount rate, to become more scheme specific over time. What this data shows is that whilst there is some movement between tranche 1 and 4, with an increase in the interquartile range of just under 0.2% per annum, i.e. from 0.56 to 0.73, since then there has been very little change in the range of discount rates adopted by pension schemes relative to gilts. My final slide focuses on the data released by a pensions regulator in relation to tranche 10 valuations. The ratio of the technical provisions to the buyout liabilities should give an indication of the prudence incorporated into the technical provisions, and so we might expect to see a link between this ratio and covenant strength. However, as you can see, analysis of the tranche 10 valuations does not provide us with any strong evidence of this. Similarly, notwithstanding other factors, the weaker the employer covenant, the lower the proportion of return-seeking assets we might expect the pension scheme to hold. Again, looking at the TPR data from tranche 10 valuations, there is not much evidence of a link between the distribution of return-seeking assets and covenant strength. As I said earlier, we do acknowledge that many schemes are adopting a scheme-specific approach, but the evidence I have referenced here today suggests this is not the case for all UK pension schemes. Within the paper, we've also looked at how different regulatory frameworks have evolved across the globe to meet some of the challenges we face here in the UK. We don't have time here today to look at these in more detail, but what is notable is that the UK is not alone in our struggle to retain a robust pension funding framework in the current financial environment and strike the right balance between affordability, adequacy and security. Perhaps the biggest challenge that all countries face is how to communicate this balance and the risks attached to the delivery of pension benefits to members. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Jig, who is going to talk through some of the investment strategy challenges considered in our paper.
Thank you, Hannah. Good evening. It's important to stress that this is not a modelling paper. However, as Murray will explain, the framework in our paper relies on building an understanding of the range of possible outcomes from the pension scheme's investment strategy and quantifying their likelihood. This chart shows a potential distribution of investment returns for a particular portfolio. For example, we would expect a return of at least 9% per annum with a 10% level of confidence, and a return of at least 5.4% per annum with 50% confidence. We've superimposed the current yield on gilts, and we'd expect the portfolio to outperform this with just over 85% confidence. There are a number of ways of deriving a distribution, but no method is perfect. One could use historic returns, but there is no guarantee that this will be repeated, and the amount of information, particularly longer-term discrete periods, for example over 20 years, is limited. It is possible to use stochastic models, but those based on normal distributions can understate the frequency and magnitude of adverse outcomes. More sophisticated asset models attempt to address this, but there is always an element of subjectivity, with the output only as good as the inputs. Applying deterministic stresses on assumed scenarios could be as useful. There are a number of other factors to consider in deriving the distribution. Firstly, what is the correct time period? Over the longer term, the risk is not achieving the level of investment returns assumed relative to the liabilities, in which case the gap needs to be filled in some other way. Over the shorter term, can the sponsor afford the impact of distressed markets and the potential increase in deficit and therefore contributions? Secondly, we need to consider what we're measuring against. The chart shows absolute returns, but it may be more relevant to consider returns relative to gilts, index-linked gilts, or inflation. But a key feature of our framework is that it is not dependent on a gilts plus approach. It could be applied to any model of future investment returns. Another important factor is the effect of cash flows, which could be of particular concern for more mature schemes. We also need to think about how the investment strategy will change in the future. Our framework encourages the investment modelling to consider not only the existing strategy as set out in the Statement of Investment Principles, but also how it is expected to change in the future. Many pension schemes hedge out key risks and expect a static investment strategy, but others anticipate future de-risking. We believe that such anticipated changes should be outlined in the Statement of Funding Principles and reflected in any modelling. Determining the appropriate measure for the scheme's technical provisions will involve the trustees and sponsors' long-term objective, the strength of sponsor covenant, risk tolerances, the intended investment strategy, and how this is to develop. These factors are inextricably linked and will require an iterative process to setting assumptions in the funding strategy. It is not the intention of this paper to say whether Gilts Plus is the correct approach or whether something else is appropriate, such as an absolute return or inflation plus. However, within the current regulatory regime, there must be an awareness of the cost of buying out a scheme's liabilities and recognition that the employer covenant supports the difference between the value of the pension scheme assets and the buyout cost of the liabilities. The strength of the employer covenant clearly impacts what is an acceptable margin between the technical provisions and the buyout cost, although just because a gap can be supported does not mean that it is the desired position. Turning to the right-hand side of the slide, for many schemes, their circumstances are such that the deficit cannot be quickly reduced to a position more in line with the size and strength of the company covenant. However, that should not mean compromising on the technical provisions. It is possible to reduce risk in the investment strategy, reflecting what can be supported by the employer covenant. However, risk management and achieving a clear understanding of the level of risk being run may well be more important than risk minimisation, as few pension schemes have the luxury of funding their obligations without taking some investment risk. I'll pass over to Murray, who will outline our proposals for a transparent and objective framework for funding pension schemes.
Thanks, Jake. Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to give you an overview of the funding framework itself. So two of the key challenges we set ourselves when developing the framework for the sessional paper were, one, how do we establish a framework that has an obvious link to the strength of the employer covenant, and how do we ensure there's transparency, understanding and agreement on the amount of risk being run within the pension scheme. We felt if the funding framework could address these two challenges, then it could represent a possible step forward in approach. The first step in the process is for all stakeholders to agree a funding objective for the pension scheme. Now, many pension schemes already do this, certainly not all. The objective might simply be to meet benefits as they fall due, so continuing to pay pensions until the last payment's made to the last member. And of course, you're going to be relying on the employer covenant over an extended period of time if you're doing that. At the other end of the spectrum, we might be targeting full settlement of liabilities, so passing those liabilities on to insurer. And we have an intermediate objective, commonly referred to as self-sufficiency, where we're targeting a level of funding that will give us confidence that we can meet members' benefits in full with a high degree of certainty and minimal reliance on the employer covenant on an ongoing basis. We then move to examine the employer covenant. Now there's lots of helpful guidance from the pensions regulator and others, and there's independent covenant assessors these days to help with this. But the key to this step is to be able to place a relative score on the employer covenant. So if you're using a different structure, if it's 1 to 5, 1 to 10, something completely different, that doesn't matter. It can still be adapted within the framework. We then make a direct link between the different covenant groups and a level of confidence that we wish to achieve. Now, there's some background in the paper on why we've chosen these particular levels of confidence, but again, as long as you have a specified structure, the exact levels are up to you. We suggested you would work with 60% confidence for strong covenants, down to or up to 90% confidence for weak covenants, simply reflecting the fact that you're going to need more certainty in a funding plan if the support from the sponsoring employer isn't as strong. And then I bring you back to the chart that Jig described earlier, and I've added some lines onto this. The red dotted line simply representing the long-term best estimate expected investment return from this particular strategy and using this particular model. That's 5.4% per annum. Everything to the right of that red dotted line can be thought of as a prudent expected return. And we are laying over that our different confidence levels. So for a strong covenant, we would be targeting 60% confidence, and under this model we would expect returns of at least 4.7% per annum. So you would end up using a discount rate of 4.7% per annum. For a tending to weak covenant, where we're targeting 80% confidence, you would be expecting returns of at least 2.9% per annum, so you'd use a discount rate of 2.9% per annum. Now, for simplicity, we are showing single discount rates here, but if you were building it up in different ways, allowing for de-risking, like Jig referred to earlier, or basing it around a yield curve, that can equally be applied. What you can quickly see, though, is you're likely to end up with a wider variety of potential discount rates, in particular when you're comparing it to the pensions regulator research that Hannah described earlier. And importantly, the discount rate you've arrived at is directly influenced by the long-term investment strategy and the employer covenant in a very structured and transparent way. Of course, this also means you're more likely to have a wider variety of potential deficits off the back of this. For genuinely strong covenants, we might even see a weakening of the funding target. For weak, maybe tending to weak covenants, you might see higher liabilities and higher deficits. In any case, we will still have recovery plans to deal with, and we will still have discussions to have with the employer and the trustees. So one of the recommendations of the paper is to adopt best estimate investment returns within the recovery plan as standard. The reasoning behind this is that if you've gone to the trouble of deriving this robust funding target that fully reflects the funding strategy, then there's no need to layer more prudence into the recovery plan itself. We suggest that using best estimate returns produces a more transparent output. The end date of the recovery plan that you're targeting is actually when you expect to get there. So it also makes it easier to monitor progress against that recovery plan over time. We do note that this may provide some easing of recovery plans for certain schemes, so alongside that, we recommend a more disciplined approach where you make a direct link between affordability levels and recovery plan length. We've suggested some possible limiting time periods in the paper, so 5 years for strong affordability, up to 15 years for weak affordability. Again, these are for suggestion to provoke debate and discussion. They're not prescribed as part of the framework. This is important, though, because if, for example, you do have a strong overall covenant and strong affordability, under the framework you might be targeting a lower deficit. So it's a reasonable expectation that you might be able to meet that deficit over a shorter period of time. For weaker affordability levels, you do know you're going to make reference to that level of affordability and you're going to need more time to reach full funding. It's also worth noting that, of course, overall covenant strength doesn't always align with affordability. You can have examples where you have cash-rich employers with weak balance sheets and vice versa. The final step of the process is to review the funding approach agreed as a whole for robustness. Can the employer manage the level of risk implied? This might involve stress and scenario testing over the intervaluation period or to the end of the recovery plan. We can refer back to Jig's analysis of the likelihood of achieving different levels of investment return over different time periods. It's also very important for the trustees to explore the likely scenarios where the deficit might become unsupportable by the employer covenant. The trustees should also check whether the employer covenant can support the level of implied self-investment risk that's represented by the pension scheme. Again, referring back to one of Jig's earlier slides, and that's the difference between the buyout liabilities and the targeted funding liabilities, or the technical provisions. The paper suggests a maximum level of implied self-investment of 50% of the value of the employer's balance sheet. Now, that 50% level has been chosen to allow for a potential deterioration in the balance sheet over time, but also to allow for the fact that on insolvency, the value of the balance sheet may be lower. Now, again, we're happy for the 50% level to be debated. It is to provoke debate and discussion, but we do believe the imposition of some sort of limit instills discipline into the process. If it does become clear that the funding strategy determined from the model isn't achievable in practice, you may need to take steps back in the process to review your assessment of the employer covenant or the long-term investment strategy that you've arrived at. It may take a number of iterations in the process to get to a solution which is acceptable for all parties, but in the end, the process itself should help to meet many of the requirements of integrated risk management. So our challenge was to establish a framework with an obvious link to the strength of the employer covenant, and I believe that the paper does that. It was also to ensure There was transparency, understanding and agreement of the level of risk being run with the pension scheme, and we believe the paper helps to achieve that. The proposed framework also allows actuaries and trustees to enhance their monitoring of the progress of the funding of a pension scheme over time. If there's changes in covenant level or investment strategy, for example, in between triennial actuarial evaluations, you can allow for that in a very structured way. A final recommendation of the paper was that off the back of the valuation process, alongside statutory documentation like the Statement of Funding Principles, a short and succinct integrated risk management statement is produced, which covers the key topics I've covered, the objective of the pension scheme, the long-term investment strategy, a summary of the covenant analysis, as well as the robustness checks carried out and the recovery plan agreed. The idea of this being this document can be picked up by a third party and they can very quickly understand exactly what the pension scheme is trying to achieve and how it's going to go about achieving it. Thank you all for listening and look forward to the debate. Hand over to Stephen.
Thanks. So as I said, we'll now have some comments from the opener, Stephen Rees. Stephen has 34 years' experience as an actuary and advisor on a full range of pension scheme issues. He's worked with a mixture of UK and global companies in a variety of corporate sectors. He's held scheme actuary practicing certificates since they were introduced in 1997. After 30 years at Towers Watson, he joined Capita in 2014, where he's now the chief actuary. As well as advising his own clients, he has responsibilities for professional standards, integrated risk management, and assumption setting. He's also a member of the Institute and Faculty's Pension Board.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you, Charles, and thank you, co-authors. Now, before I make any specific comments, I must emphasise that I'm not speaking on behalf of the Pensions Board, and nor am I speaking on behalf of my employer. Now, I welcome this paper. Good advice on the funding of defined benefit pension schemes and on the understanding of the ultimate cost and the associated risks is central to the reasons why pensions actuaries are employed. It results in us having a seat at the table of decision makers more readily than any other advisor. Sometimes there can be a tendency for an actuary to give advice based on industry averages or based on what we think the regulator might want. And this is too lazy and it doesn't justify the levels of fees that we charge. We need events like this to test ideas, to acknowledge different opinions, to enable us all to do our best thinking when we're giving client-specific advice. Now, the paper itself covers a large number of areas, not all completely connected. I plan to make some initial observations about a number of these in this slot, and I'm hoping that these encourage some debate. Now, the authors point out in the introduction, and Hannah's emphasised it just now, the lack of evidence that employer covenant strength really is making any difference to investment strategy and funding strategy. And we also know that the regulator is equally frustrated by this. The statistics are to some extent affected by, at one end, we've got strong employers choosing more cautious strategies, and at the other end, by trustees with weak employers choosing pragmatic strategies because they seem to be the only way to make the numbers add up. We can usefully discuss whether the problem is the design of the legislation or whether legislation is fine and the problem is specific to the implementation, or even whether there isn't really a problem in the first place. Now, also in the introduction is the first reference to there being two objectives to pension funding. I hope that we stay very clear that there are really only two sorts of actuarial calculations. Sometimes we answer the question, what do we think is going to happen? And we use an ongoing method. And other times we answer the question, well, what happens if the employer fails? And we use a solvency method. The worst thing that we can do is to attempt to fudge the two separate questions into a single one. And this is one of the lessons, I believe, that we learned from the MFR, which takes us neatly on to Chapter 2. I was actually slightly disappointed that the history lesson began only 15 years ago. Actuaries under the age of 45, I think, yes, we've got some in the room, didn't live through the decades when pension funding actually made sense. Until about 1990, the ongoing funding target was almost always higher than the discontinuance target. Imagine that. Now, for those who didn't live through the process of the MFR being proposed and designed and debated and implemented during the mid-1990s, I will just mention one of the most important achievements of the actuarial profession. And it was nothing to do with the mathematics of the MFR. The first version was called the minimum solvency requirement. And to our credit, our profession explains to the politicians the difference between solvency and funding. Now, on one point of detail, I do disagree with paragraph 2.3.12. I believe that most actuaries know that when using a dual discount rate, they do know that they are creating a model that reflects an evolution in the scheme's future investment strategy. That's an assertion, I hope it's true, but we'll find out later on perhaps. Now then we have chapter 4. To be honest, I'm not completely sure what chapter 4 is doing in here. It doesn't have a clear connection with the previous chapters or indeed the subsequent chapters. The subject described as financial economics does, however, have the ability to generate a lot of arguments amongst actuaries, and I hope that today's discussion can avoid repeating those debates so that we can spend time on the more useful elements of this paper. I will, however, express one little disappointment that of the many papers referred to in this chapter, it doesn't include a reference to the paper presented in this hall to the Staple Inn Actuarial Society in August 2004 by Salman Khan. In my opinion, still the best paper that has been presented to SIAS. Chapter 6 is a very nice summary of what's been going on in other countries. Whilst we're left to have our own opinions on the lessons, my feeling at the end was that the best minds in all of these countries have failed to come up with a perfect solution. Chapter 8 starts with an excellent commentary on the expression increasingly used within the pensions industry, self-sufficiency. The first parts of paragraph 8.3 explain perfectly why this is a flawed concept. I see it being used in communication material in the pensions industry in a way that borders on dishonesty. We have to face up to the fact that there are two separate questions for us to do. If the solvency calculation generates unpleasant results, we do nobody any favours by dreaming up other calculations that give more palatable results and giving them the wrong name. So then we come to chapters 9 to 12, which contain the main proposals. The main proposal is to use the stochastic method to generate a range of possible expected future asset returns and then use the covenant assessment to decide the appropriate level of confidence, resulting in the determination of the correct discount rate. I give general support to this approach, not least because it's been in fairly widespread use for the last 10 years at one of the big 3 consulting firms where I used to work. I'm also aware of its occasional use at 3 medium-sized consulting firms. Now, the practical problems that I remember included the following. The feeling amongst some clients that the answer emerged from a black box, the difficulty in obtaining a covenant assessment so clear and reliable that it could be used as a simple input to the process, the difficulty in using a covenant assessment with a time horizon of maybe a couple of years, if you're lucky, for a set of modelling calculations that need to cover several decades. And then the difficulty in working out, well, which covenant rating should map to which probabilities. Is 60% right for strong and 70% right for tending to strong? And why is that right, or why isn't it right? And the fact that a probability of 90% would typically take you the far side of the solvency calculation. So, points that I'm hoping that members will express opinions on in this evening's discussion are as follows. Is the regulator's frustration at covenant making only a small difference to investment and funding strategy an issue of design or an issue of implementation? Should we be more careful with the expression self-sufficiency? Does it make sense to allow for best estimate investment returns in recovery plans? It makes the funding calculations mathematically incoherent, and I'm fairly sure it wasn't intended by the DWP. And finally, what do those members already using a stochastic method for setting discount rates find are the strengths and weaknesses in practice. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We'll open the discussion to the floor at this stage. I think we had about 5 or 6 people who put their hands up right at the beginning. If we could start with those. I'm sure following the presentation and Stephen's thought-provoking comments, there are probably more things that people would like to comment on, so please do. But if we start, I think we had some comments towards the front here. Do you want to put your hands back up for those who wanted to speak?
My name is Bryn Davis. I'm more a critic of funding methods, but I have been a scheme actuary, so I've seen it from both sides. What I'm not clear from the paper, I've still got to plough through the whole paper, I have to admit, but certainly wasn't mentioned by the introducers, is what's the problem. Unless you've got a clear idea what the problem is, it's very difficult to come up with a solution. Are we aware, I'm not, but are people aware of lots of schemes out there which are currently or prospectively going to be unable to pay their members benefits because the actuary chose a discount rate of 3.5 instead of 2.5? Is that the problem? Because I think we need a bit more data. I think we as actuaries have delusions of grandeur when it comes to valuations. We think that by making the valuation system more and more complex, incorporating more and more data, we will come up with better answers. Unfortunately, that is the delusion. We just don't have enough information to do that effectively. The only executive outcome of the valuation is what the employer is going to pay over the next 3 years, with the opportunity within those 3 years of doing interim checks to see if it needs to change. That's all we get out of the valuation. You have a long report with masses of information in it, but all that comes out of it is the employer's contribution over the next 3 years. And I think I am pleased and glad that all this work has been done, but I think we need to be a bit more modest in terms of what we're actually trying to do.
Thank you, Bryn. I think the intention is that we will take all of the comments rather than replying to them individually, and then Charles will comment at the end. If there's anybody else who wants to speak, please raise your hand. Shani, if we have the 2 at the front here.
I work at the pensions regulator, but I speak here today as a pensions actuary. Discount rates. Back in 2010, they were an emotive subject when Chris Dakin and I were commissioned by the IFOA to provide the initial thought leadership on the discount rate project. And as we've just heard, they are an emotive subject today as well, because people somehow seem to find a link between discount rates and sustainability of pension schemes, which I fail to understand. In working through the discount rate project, we came up with 2 observations. One was the distinction we made between the matching and the budgeting calculations, because that we thought allowed trustee pensions actuaries and their clients to actually think a lot more about the context, the purpose, and so on. And then we also made a further recommendation, which was that the communication of the discount rates, as it currently is, a single discount rate, a percentage rate, is one-dimensional and lacking, because each discount rate carries with it an embedded risk, and we were suggesting that somehow that embedded risk also needed to be communicated. Now, in the work I've done at the regulator since, I've learned that that in itself would not have been enough either, because just communicating the risk itself isn't sufficient. We need to understand a lot more about how that risk is managed, and is that the management plan effective. So with that background, I do welcome today's paper, because the authors provide a good and sensible framework within which actuary can think about this, but more importantly, the actuary can engage the clients to think about setting clear long-term objective, having some strategy to get there, understanding the risks embedded in that strategy, checking to see whether the funding plan is robust enough to withstand those risks, and also trying to understand what the client would do if they found themselves on the wrong side of the risk. Would they, for example, need to resort to some extreme measures, which may be unfortunate and which may cause them to go back and rethink the strategy? And above all, something that the regulator has been emphasizing of recent, demonstrating that the trustees have actually thought through all of this. Now, sadly, I don't see enough valuation reports myself on a regular basis, because they're only we only get them on request, and that doesn't happen all that often. But when I do see them, I see very little, I'm sad to say, in the actuary's report, which explains some of the thought processes that the authors are recommending behind the assessment of the risks, and how it is that the actuary has come to the comfortable position that those risks are manageable, and manageable by the sponsor without having to resort to extreme measures. So I think this is a very good contribution to the debate that TPR started 4 or 5 years ago, and I welcome the paper. I would probably take some issue with some of the detail, but those are secondary. The two things I might just flag are that it would have been good to see some sort of link between scheme maturity and the recovery plan lens, because they are important as schemes mature. And they introduce a whole host of new risks which are important to manage. And also, I would have liked to have seen some way of managing this big problem of lack of visibility in the long-term assessment of the covenant, because if you don't understand the long-term covenant, then that in itself brings in some risks, and how are they factored into the funding plan? Thank you.
Thank you, Shanu. I think we have another contributor here at the front.
Okay, David Kewell, Punter Southall. So, delighted to speak again. I think I spoke at Charles's last paper. In fact, I opened it, and I spoke at the Port Thornton Wilson paper. Hopefully, I'm consistent. That would be a change, probably. And I think I would have said that security is the key, because security is the key. That's what the members are hoping for, but 100% security isn't necessary. In fact, not getting 100% isn't a disaster, although getting 0%, as the ASW people were exposed to, could be a disaster. So funding to less than 100% of buyout, actually that gives voice to the trustees saying how much they're willing to risk the members' benefits for the covenant of the employer, which I think is an interesting way of looking at it, to say I don't want to fund for 100%, but I will let you run a risk. You, the member, run a risk, the risk being that you won't get your benefits. The history was interesting. Like Stephen, I thought it could go back further, where we could find the seeds of our own demise. In this hall, there was a paper, Pension Scheme Wind-Up, Legitimate Act or Smash and Grab, by Jonathan Punter and Stuart Southall, coincidentally. And it showed that actually in the 80s, pension schemes were fully funded on buyout, and schemes were being wound up and surpluses taken away. So times change. And what made that happen? Well, inflation was our saviour. Inflation reduced benefits, and that was accepted, and that was acceptable. And this is, of course, what the PPF does. Reduction in benefits is acceptable to PPF, and Charles's graphic shows that there are only two outcomes. You either get a little bit more than PPF, or you get all your benefits. And there's not that big a gap in between. And one way of looking at it is that we should, as actuaries and schemes, should be looking to maximise that gap, maximise above the PPF. Now, that would be putting members first. Unfortunately, it's not what TPR or PPF would like you to do. And that challenge, therefore, goes to the PPF and the TPR to be much more explicit about what the minimum funding they are looking for. And they may not have to be explicit as the MFR, but they could be implicit, because actions speak a lot louder than words. Meanwhile, I think the IFA needs to, if it really wants to get an Institute of Faculty, if they really want to get involved in covenant measure, they need to revisit their 2005 paper on what actuaries can do on covenant, because that effectively stops actuaries doing covenant work. I've seen some draft legal advice which says when a scheme actuary has a contribution role to fulfill, they must get independent advice based on the Institute of Actuaries 2005 paper. I think that's very dangerous. I think that stops the Institute and Actuaries becoming central to the integrated risk management. I think Actuaries should be encouraged to become covenant specialists, just as they're encouraged to become investment specialists, so we can advise on all three corners of the integrated risk management. It's not something we should shy away from, it's something we should follow and encourage. I think the financial economics part of the paper actually was useful, raising it again, Stephen, because I think the financial economics does help us see some issues. One of which is that there are three assets to the pension scheme. There are the physical assets, the assets you own, the investments. There's the call on the employer, and there's the call on the PPF. That's what provides the members' benefits. And to maximise two calls, you want volatility. And volatility means risky investments. That's what financial economics tells us. Optimal for trustees might be to put everything in risky assets, if you follow financial economics. And often, the real world follows economics. I'll finish off with a couple of other areas we could look at. You could try and estimate loss, like the insurers would do. You could express a valuation instead of being X% funded. There's an expected loss of 3% of your benefits for members, and the trustee's objective is to improve that. Or you could look at the risk of ruin, the chance of a scheme failing, which is again an insurance technique. I think we can learn a lot from our colleagues. Many thanks.
Thank you, David. If we have another one just over there.
Thank you. David Benstead. I'd like to, shall I stand up? Just like to add to Bryn's question, where he said, what's the problem? How can we find an answer if we don't know what the problem is? I'll pose a different question. What does success look like? What does a successful pension scheme look like? If we don't know what a successful pension scheme look like, how can we create an appropriate funding and investment plan? So I suggest a successful pension scheme is one which is open to new entrants. An open scheme has a funding and investment strategy, and an employer's share of the cost, which the employer is happy with. An open scheme provides benefits for future generations of members, as it has for past generations, minimising intergenerational differences of pension provision. And intergenerational issues are exercising many minds at the moment. So if we first decide on a design for benefits, funding and investment, which an employer would willingly sponsor for future service, then that gives us our guide for the funding plan of the scheme. We should demonstrate that we're experts in provision of pensions by, funnily enough, providing pensions. We don't demonstrate our expertise by shutting pension schemes down to new entrants and to future accrual. We demonstrate our expertise by showing whether successful compromise of benefits, contribution and risk lies. We should be modifying schemes towards successful compromises involving being open to new members, not closing them down.
Thank you. Yeah, we've got some comments at the front.
Thank you. John Spain, GAD, speaking entirely personally. We must thank Charles and his colleagues for putting this paper up, even if perhaps not all of us agree with all of it in it, or perhaps any of it. You spend a lot of time and energy, but I think the structure is really based on quicksand. I'm one of those cited in paragraph 112, and I'm proud of it. I do think that actuaries and trustees have been far too prudent, leading directly to pension scheme liabilities being overstated, especially with the very frequent alarmist projections, 200 trillion in deficit, as if it's all going to happen. That's slightly high. In paragraph 2.7.2, I find it very surprising that trustees' duties are defined by reference to a TPR web page. Surely that should be defined according to legal expertise. TPR have a duty, but it's not to provide legal advice to us or to anybody else. My main problems actually come from section 4, because I do not believe that financial economics are relevant. As financial scientists, which is what actuaries should be, we should be following the evidence. There is absolutely no evidence anywhere, and I've asked people to look for it, that financial economics has any relevance or will help funding of long-term entities. Short-term, fine, but not long-term. If there is any, please point us to it. Market values don't have any predictive return power. Higher achieved return investment returns must reduce costs for the same benefits. There is a huge concentration of risk, as if it necessarily crystallizes, without any probability being ascribed to the risk of default. 65 years ago, in this very hall, Frank Reddington pointed out that if you pursue the lack of a loss, you also pursue the lack of a profit. Not good idea. Prudence, great idea, at somebody's expense. It will normally be the sponsor's expense, but you can only define whether or not you are prudent if you know where your best estimate is. In the presentation we've just seen, slides 10, 11 and 21 actually show the evidence based upon nominal discount rates. I'm surprised that nominal discount rates are considered in any way useful for deciding whether or not there's any difference between CG1 and CG4, because it is real discount rates that matter. And each of those could have had their future inflation defined in different ways. And if somebody says, well, of course, everybody's defined RPI as a difference between the yields on long-term conventional gilts and long-term index-linked gilts, the evidence is that that's way overstates the true outcome. So that's probably not good. The real problem is that risk quantification cannot adequately be captured by scalars. One number does not describe all of the different things that can happen. And this brings us back really to the discount rate as a problem, not as a solution. The discount rate was always merely the inverse operator of future investment returns. But when we started off, we didn't have the ability to do the sums going forward. We do now, we should be using that, and then we can provide clients with proper advice, such as if you keep contributions going at the current rate, you've got a 30% chance of going bust within 10 years, or whatever it might be. Stochastic processes give a better indication, but they don't need to be black boxes. The actuary should be saying to the trustees, I think that suitable distributions for this variable should be Wakeby, not log normal or normal. None of them are that. It needn't be black box, and they can be cross-examined on it, second opinions can be taken, but using a flat discount rate or even two discount rates doesn't give much information. It hides the information, obscures it. Why do we do that? I agree with the authors on one thing. DB funding needs a great deal of attention. We need to do better than we are doing at the moment. But these suggestions rest upon quicksand. So I implore Council and Pensions Board to commission another paper, go back to basics, look at the evidence. This may not be fashionable, it may not be what everybody in the room thinks, but I think we should be doing something rather different, rather more grounded in reality. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Con?
Sorry, Con Keating, I'm a guest. I have actually prepared a written submission. The submission concerns a very fundamental problem, which is this idea that the purpose of funding, the purpose of this exercise is to pay benefits as they fall due, meaning after sponsor has become insolvent. There is a very significant problem with that, which is that it breaches the principle of equity, which is a very fundamental English law, or canon of English law. The irony really is that it was another breach of the principle of equity, well illustrated in Allied Steel and Wire, that led to all of this all of this regulation that we've seen. It was the fact that pensioners in payment would continue to receive everything, while some active members could receive nothing. That created so much kerfuffle, and in fact led to all of the regulation that we've subsequently seen. That is a very, very fundamental problem with the way in which we are looking at things now. I will add one other point, which actually only came across to me this evening while listening to this presentation. And that is the question of feasibility of any of this stuff, given the horizons that we are looking at. Now, a pension is simply a claim on future production. Funding is a method of acquiring assets today with the hope that they will produce sufficient in the future. If you actually consider the assets that you can purchase today and look at what proportion of future production those assets are likely to generate, you will see that the problem you have is huge. In fact, it's not possible to resolve it. You're in the land of the imponderable rather than the sort of thing you're trying to do. You can't forecast, no one can forecast, sponsor insolvency likelihoods at horizons of 60 years or 70 years, nor can you forecast meaningfully return over that period of time. There is a genuine feasibility problem here, which renders most of what you are talking about doing absolutely redundant.
Any further comments from the floor? Thanks, we've got one at the back.
It's Chris O'Brien. I welcome the paper. Not only has pension funding been in the news, but it's also relevant to the Department of Work and Pensions paper issued earlier this year on the issues around the security and sustainability of DB schemes. This paper is important because I believe there is a problem and what happens about pension valuations does need to change. What I particularly like about the paper is the distinction it draws between budgeting calculations on the one hand and matching calculations on the other. I believe that any discussion of pension funding has to recognise the difference between these two approaches. The authors consider the scheme-specific funding regime in the UK and are surprised that there is not a closer relationship between the choice of discount rates in calculating the scheme's technical provisions and the strength of the employer covenant. In their proposals illustrated in Appendix 2, the discount rate specifically reflects the employer covenant. However, I would question whether this is appropriate. If an employer becomes financially stronger, but assuming that the investment strategy of the pension scheme is unchanged, then I see no reason for the liabilities to be calculated differently. I believe there is a much more straightforward approach. That is to say that the liabilities are unchanged, but that the trustees may wish to take into account the greater strength of the employer in determining what is an acceptable investment strategy and what is an acceptable deficit. That is surely more transparent than adjusting the discount rate, and it is consistent with integrated risk management. For decisions on funding, contribution and investment strategy, I would have preferred the paper to devote more attention to the different perspectives of sponsor and of trustees and their different attitudes to risk. And the trustees have to take into account the way in which there isn't uniformity among scheme members, for example, between pensioners and contributing members. I now turn to what information should be presented to scheme members about the financial strength of the scheme. The authors conclude that member communication based on a budgeting calculation gives misleading information about the security of members' benefits. I believe that that is entirely correct, and as the authors say, it's consistent with the conclusion of the Profession's Discount Rate Project. Charles was, of course, one of the authors of the paper on the project. It's worth saying that that project began when the profession commissioned research on discount rates which was carried out by Chris Dakin and Chinu Patel. It was then taken forward by the Management Committee, appointing a steering committee of senior members across the range of the profession's interests, including pensions, who presented a sessional paper in 2011. This confirmed the appropriateness of the distinction between budgeting and matching calculations that Dakin and Patel had put forward. In particular, the Working Party recommended that the funding information provided to pension scheme trustees, members and regulators should focus on the solvency position, which should use a matching calculation. Budgeting calculations would not be reliable or adequate for that purpose. However, we find that practice is rather different. Members receive a summary funding statement showing a funding ratio where the assets are at market value and the liabilities are the technical provisions calculated with a discount rate which may be based on gilt yields or prudent expected investment returns. Scheme members are not told what kind of discount rate has been used. This disclosure is largely meaningless, bearing in mind that the discretion in the choice of discount rate can lead to up to, say, 30 or 40% change in the liabilities. Further, since the usual practice is for the discount rate in the technical provisions to reflect prudent expected investment returns, this is a budgeting calculation and not the matching calculation that is appropriate for member disclosure. Now, it is true that the summary funding statement usually discloses the funding, usually discloses the funding ratio with the liabilities calculated as the insurance buyout cost. This is a form of matching calculation, although if the trustees do not intend to buy an insurance policy, then it can be argued that the buyout cost inflates somewhat the cost to the trustees of meeting the liabilities themselves. However, it is common in summary funding statements for the trustees to state that this information on the buyout cost is provided because it's required by regulation, and trustees have no intention of closing the scheme or buying insurance. The implication is that members should focus not on the funding ratio using the buyout cost, but instead on the funding position using the technical provisions. The problem is this is entirely inappropriate. The liabilities of pension scheme depend on factors such as salary, length and service and longevity. They don't depend on investment strategy in the way that using technical provisions implies. We should have a matching calculation instead. It's over 6 years since the sessional paper on the discount rate project, and we haven't seen the progress that I would have liked towards matching calculations being the focus of member disclosure. Now, this may reflect the way that we have regulations on valuations and disclosure. Now, what was positive was that earlier this year, the DWP issued a green paper and asked for comments on what information would be helpful to members to understand the funding position of their scheme. It's a golden opportunity for the profession to say that the focus should be on matching calculations. One option would be to recommend that there is an emphasis on the insurance buyout cost rather than downplaying it. Alternatively, it would be possible to develop a matching calculation for liabilities where the discount rate is based on gilt yields or swaps and potentially an adjustment to reflect the illiquidity of pension liabilities. Unfortunately, the response to the DWP from the Pensions Board appears satisfied with the current practice. It's not clear whether the Pension Board members reject the recommendations of the discount rate project that matching calculations should be the focus of disclosure to members. If so, it would be as well for the Pensions Board to be upfront about this, but also to recognise that they are at odds with the views of many members of the profession. My hope is that the paper presented today will stir the Pensions Board into accepting that matching and not budgeting calculations are appropriate for informing members about the financial strength of their scheme. At present, there is the potential for members to be misled. The actuarial professions cannot stand by and do nothing. Pension valuations do need to change.
Thanks very much, and thanks to you all for considering the paper and for the thought that went into those comments. I think given that there's quite a lot there, it might be a good idea now just to pause briefly and give Charles an opportunity to respond to some of those very briefly.
Okay, thank you, Marion. Lots of comments. Thank you all for your comments, and I'm sure the IFOA will also be very happy to take any written comments. Certainly, we as authors would be very keen and happy to receive written comment. We absolutely accept that there's lots of parts of this paper that could be explored further. I'm not going to respond to every comment, or else we'll be here all evening. I will just pick up on a few of the things and questions that were raised. I agreed with much of what Stephen said. We shouldn't be fudging the two questions that I posed at the outset. They are separate questions and need separate answering. I similarly have reservations about self-sufficiency where it's not, where it's defined as something other than solvency, unless it's really clear to all parties concerned the residual risk that still exists within that sort of framework. Both Bryn and Derek asked, well, what's the problem? I would have thought the problem was quite clear. When the PPF was established, we had 7,800 pension schemes. We now have 5,800 pension schemes. The PLSA research that we referred to estimates, and the PPF agrees with this, their expectation is at least 1,000 pension schemes will fall into the PPF over the next 20 or 30 years. And in that 1,000 or so pension schemes, members will lose benefits. Now, it may be that people are quite happy with the PPF level of benefits, and that loss is an acceptable loss for the benefit of not funding to a much more stringent level. Well, that's fine, but I don't see that that's properly communicated to members. I absolutely agree, maybe not surprisingly, with what Chris said towards the end around some of our failings to communicate to members the fact that their benefits are at risk, that pensions are different from insurance company, and that pension benefits are risky benefits, whereas insurance company benefits, in theory at least, are guaranteed. Where that risk is material, members should be told, is my view. And Bryn, you say the only output from the valuation is what is the employer going to pay. Well, if that is the only output from the valuation, I think that's a pretty poor do, because I would say that the output from the valuation should include helping the trustees and members to understand the risk that benefits might not be paid. Chinu made lots of helpful comments, and I would point to lots of the helpful supporting information that's on the regulator's website, particularly around covenant, with all the problems that go with that. And here I will somewhat unusually agree with Con in that clearly there are significant challenges with looking forward and trying to put a value on employer covenant well into the future. It's well nigh impossible. Well, where I'm a trustee, and I am a trustee of one pension scheme, for me that means that the longer the time frame I'm looking at, the less risk I want to take. And I want that to be clearly understood, and I want members to understand it. And if I'm taking if you like, a long-term bet that the employer is going to be there in 30 or 40 years, I think that needs to be clearly understood, and the risk that then potentially results to members. But I fully accept that there are real challenges there, but that doesn't mean that we turn our back on them. Many people, David included, pointed to the importance of security, and I do feel that is key in what we're trying to set out here. This is, yes, it's about financing a long-term cash flow obligation, and I accept John's point that you condense everything into a single discount rate, you're losing a lot of information. That does not detract from the reality that the purpose of holding assets is to provide security. And we need to measure that security, and that's where matching calculation and the solvency calculation is all important. So I think I've said enough. It's a really important debate, and maybe we ought to have, whether or not there's a paper to discuss, it's a debate that we as pension actuaries need to revisit on a regular basis, because our expertise and our ability to advise our clients in a way that stands up to what being an actuary is, certainly for me, needs this debate to be continually refreshed. So I welcome your contributions. We've had an interesting debate, and I hope it doesn't stop there.
Thank you, Charles. Cliff has kindly agreed to provide some closing comments. Cliff Speed is responsible for the 10 billion investment portfolio of the Pensions Trust Retirement Solutions. He's an experienced CIO and actuary with over 20 years' experience in risk management. Cliff has worked in asset management, insurance, consultancy, investment banking, and has been a university lecturer. On top of all that, he's published numerous papers on risk management for pension schemes. Thanks, Cliff.
Thank you to the authors and the contributors for reinvigorating this debate, as Charles said. And the comments, as usual, are my own, not any of the employers, as past or present. A brief summary, as many people have picked up on. The paper provides an interesting history of MFR. It provides good analysis of TPR data and an interesting comparison of practices around the world. But the crux of the paper is providing a framework that links funding to the employer-sponsor covenant. The authors recognise that a pension scheme is trying to provide funding a long-term obligation while providing security to members' benefits. And those twin themes keep on coming back throughout the debate. Another element which has come out throughout the debate is the distinction from the Discount Working Party project on the difference between budgeting, which projects forward values to allow for expected returns, and the matching calculation, which is more used for transactional work. Many observations were made along the way in the paper, which I think are important and worth being reminding ourselves on, about the deficit on a buyout basis as an unsecured loan, and the asset allocation does not impact the value of the liabilities. From this strong foundation, the authors then proceed to develop a modelling framework where returns are projected and, depending upon the covenant strength, different discount rates and hence different TP measures are provided. So covenant, investment and funding have been synthesised into an integrated approach as advocated by the regulator. Well done to the authors. They've set out what they tried to do. There are also some good, strong recommendations. A better minimum funding standard is one linked to matching calculation that's been suggested in this room before. More transparent and fair approach would be to have an agreed percentage of buyout basis as a target. An objective should be clearly stated and self-investment should be understood. These are well-researched and well-thought-out conclusions, and I ask myself, what does this mean in practice? If this was taken up and implemented, what would it really mean? Well, I'm glad to say the authors have helped us there as well, because in Appendix 2 there's a little example. Okay? This example starts off and it shows us the solvency value of liabilities of 202 and assets of 100. We may suppose that the liabilities look something like this, your standard armadillo of the projected cash flows of the liabilities. The authors then point out that the deficit, or the self-investment, is the difference between those two values. Okay. Next, the proposed framework is applied, and this needs a whole range of assumptions, as been discussed, on asset allocation, returns, covenant strength, time horizons, etc. And from this, we generate a technical provisions of 127 million. This is some 75 million less than the solvency number. Okay? So we ask ourselves, well, how does this fit with the facts we had earlier? For example, that asset allocation, because this is clearly based upon a 50% equity asset allocation, does not change the value of the liabilities. But now our deficit has gone from being around about 102 to being just down to 27. Does this fit in with the transparent communication, which is the recommendation from the paper? Okay, some of you say I'm being unfair. It is clearly stated that the approach is budgeting. Have I fallen into that sin of mixing up matching and budgeting approaches? Well, okay, let's correct for that. Let me update the liabilities. There you are, it's quite subtle, you have to watch closely. Of course, the liabilities don't change. If I'm doing a projection, I've already projected them. It doesn't matter if I'm holding 50% in equities, 100% in equities. The liabilities stay the same. So I think what is happening is the wrong side of the balance sheet is being adjusted. Here's an alternative presentation of what the authors have, which I think may be a fairer representation. I think what they're really saying is that you have a certain amount of assets. Over time, there will be some expected returns. Now, these expected returns are, of course, uncertain. So, we should allow for risk, because as the paper reminds us, it is a blunder, if not a crime, for a fiduciary trustee to believe equity risk decreases over time. So we need to think about and allow for risk. In addition to that, there are deficit contributions. If these are added in, we find we have a target of 63% of the solvency liabilities. And I think it's that side of the balance sheet which is being amended. We still have the loan to the sponsor or self-investment. And here's an interesting thought experiment. Imagine if we're in the happy position of being funded to that solvency level, the 202 million. Then someone approaches the trustee and said, I've got an excellent investment for you. How about this? You can make an unsecured loan which has no repayment date, pays no interest, and it's in a single entity. Would that be a great idea? Well, that's economically what this self-investment is on the right-hand side. Okay? But maybe we can square this, and this is part of the budgeting, because maybe it's not about being 100% certain. Is this then a framework which we as a profession should be advocating? Possibly. There are mixed feelings I take around the room. But let's try and flex some of the other parameters. What happens now if I apply the framework and assume a 75% investment in equities? Then I find my TP level has gone down to 99. That is 49% of the solvency value, and I have turned a deficit into a surplus. Now, there may not be a perfect model, but I think it is beholden to us to think about how does this affect stakeholders? What motivations would this engender? Would this facilitate good risk management? I think this might need a little bit more debate. So, there is much to commend this paper, and thank you. I think it is time this debate was reinvigorated. If experience, the name we give to our mistakes, is wild at it, then I think we've got a lot of experience, and we should be able to build upon that. My personal opinion is I think the authors have worked hard and done a good job trying to square the circle of how you get all these bits to fit within the regulatory framework. What's gone wrong? I don't think it's the author's line of thought. I think it's trying to put it within the regulatory framework. I personally believe that the regulatory framework is flawed and does not encourage good practice. I would like the authors and maybe the profession to be bolder and set out a coherent framework which will serve millions of people better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. I think from the comments in the room, it's clear that this is an area that deserves additional debate. There certainly isn't a consensus amongst pension scheme actuaries as to how we slot covenants, investment and funding risk into a neat model, and perhaps it would be irresponsible of us to do so. This is a nuanced area and needs some deep thought about how we do deliver value for each of the clients, whether they be the corporate sponsors or the trustees of the pension schemes that we advise. It remains for me to express my own thanks, and I'm sure the thanks of everybody in the room, to the authors, opener, closer, and all of those who participated in this evening's discussion. It would also be very helpful for those preparing the transcript of the discussion for the British Actuarial Journal if you could hand any prepared notes to the events team at the back of the hall as you leave the meeting. Thank you very much.